Hey, today I'm gonna look at and work on fixing some italics for this family named Sans. So name Sans is pretty far along. Here's its little mini site. You can come in here and try it out, type with it and stuff. If you haven't seen it before, name Sans has an optical size axis. So at the high end of this, it's for really big use, where letters are pretty tightly spaced, and that also affects the weight range, which goes from super heavy to extremely light. Whereas, for instance, if you lower the optical size, it's less extreme on either end. The goal is basically it should show up at a small size here, and with its wider spacing, it should be really easy to read even in very small text. It has an italic version of the family right now, which only has the small optical size. So the idea here is it's still kind of this is a Safari rendering thing bug. The goal here, or the logic behind releasing the small text optical size italics first, is that if you're making a lot of things that require italics, it's going to be text in like a book or something, where you're already probably using the small optical size. But of course, like this family, just to be complete, needs some display italics, or at least that's my intention for it. By the way, this is kind of a cool little mini site, I think. It shows a lot of the various things you can do with this family. There's like quite a few open type features where you can really change the personality of the family and dial it in to be kind of exactly what you want it to be. Yeah. So like if you really want, say, simple L's, like a lot of neo-grotesque families have, you could do that. Simple T's, simple A's, etc., etc. All right, so the thing is, I haven't yet drawn the source fonts required to make the display italics. So knowing what I mean by that, if you're not already super into drawing type, gosh, I don't know how much to break it down really. There's better areas you could see this information, and it's not really the intention to spell it all out in this video, but essentially a variable font, or most modern font families, even if they're not variable, exist in the background or in the source formats as like multiple sources, or sometimes they're called masters, though that language is of course somewhat outdated, where basically if you draw the light style and you draw the bold style, you can interpolate between those things. So that means you can drag, or rather the computer will calculate the point locations for every kind of number between two numbers. And that allows for variable fonts or static interpolated fonts and things. When you start adding multiple axes and a really wide weight range, you need more sources to handle that kind of change. And so already just the uprights of name sans, there are these 6 primary sources, I think of them as. And then there are also multiple support sources where just a few letters are corrected along the way. So yeah, I'll kind of show a preview here of these files. So here's the display bold. This is kind of what I think of as the home base of this family. Here's the display hairline, which is super, super hairlined. Oops, don't know what I did there. Yep, I'll get into that because that's what I'll be drawing the italic of for a bit in this video. Here's the display ultra, super thick. And then on the text side, bold, hairline, ultra. And then, as I said, there are support sources, also sometimes known as sparse sources. So for instance, at 500, which is the medium weight, the contrast got too high, like the middle bar of the E and A and S, like those were getting quite thin, because if you see in the bold, it doesn't really look like it here, but the middle bar has to be kind of slightly like thinned out to optically make the letter look correct. But it is quite a bit thinner than, say, the stem of the F or the side of the E. And yet in hairline, these are all the same thickness. And so in between those things, we need a few sources to say, like, no, I really actually do want it to be basically the exact same thickness up to the point it can be. And then there are other sparse sources here. So I also make similar corrections at 200 and 100. For instance, the main thing I'm correcting at 100 are the joins of letters. So early on in this design process, before I had the sparse support at 100, the joints for, say, the N were extremely fine, because just going from this ridiculously thin hairline to a bold kind of geometrically resulted in that happening. So it needs a correction to kind of have this monolinear look early on in the weight range. There are fewer supports needed at the text end of the spectrum, and because of that, I didn't have to make these sparse sources for the italics just yet. And italics are just kind of like a much less used version of a font. Obviously, they're important sometimes for emphasis, but like people never or very seldom revolve a whole identity around italics. And you would never, for instance, buy just an italic font not in support of an upright font, or almost never. Some designers, in fact, just don't support or don't add italics to a family because they make the rational decision like, well, people don't need it anyway, which is valid. But here, this is kind of a family I want to do everything. So, or be very versatile. So let me describe for a second the italic process I use now that I've kind of described the background of the sources for this family. A hard thing about italics is that you can't just click a button and make it work, at least not yet. It's a surprising amount of basically redrawing that you have to do to make italics look correct. And I'll explain what I mean here. But by the way, in the background here, this is VS Code. This is the code editor I like to use. And this is a script that takes the main sources I have for this family up here, and these are called UFO. It's a font file format. And this does a variety of things on it. Some of this code is copied from another person's extension called slnt, which is meant to help you slant letters to sort of prepare italics. I wanted it to be a script I could run on my UFOs to kind of combine a couple of options and output them to a folder. So the folder that they output to, I've called it faux italics. This script basically goes through the top level masters folder and say duplicates each one into here, and then both rotates and slants letters depending on their categorization. So for instance, if we look at the display bold, this kind of shows what's happening. A lot of letters are all straight lines. So you can basically get what you want by just slanting them. So for instance, like the H, you can just go ahead and slant. And maybe, you know, it's useful to correct the contrast here if you're getting really specific with it. Like on the display side, I probably will go and correct this contrast a little bit. Some people like to make an italic a little narrower than the upright counterpart. That's kind of a thing that traditionally happens in especially serif fonts, but I don't really think it's necessarily a requirement. And a lot of the times, in fact, I don't think it's necessarily a good thing to optimize for. And then, all right, so then other glyphs actually, like if you simply slant, maybe I better show this actually in practice more, but if you simply slant like an S or an O, yeah, I'll do that. I'll pop open my display bold, and oops, I don't know if that's the version of RoboFont I want to use. Anyway, it'll be fine. So here I've got an O. Maybe I'll also open it in the Space Center so you can see it. And if I straight up just slant this to the italic angle I want, which I believe is 11.31, which is kind of derived from, I think, over 1 up 5 units, you can, and the idea there is that it's easier to count like how I'm moving points around, and perhaps things will line up better on a grid when, say, it's anti-aliasing. All right, so if I want to slant this by that italic angle, is that the correct? Nope, totally the wrong one. If I just straight up skew it, it's going to look like that. And you can see here, it's really pretty bad. The lines get thicker here and thinner here. It's quite pointy here and too flat here. So if I like check out the H and do the same thing to kind of give some context here, you can see that like the H looks mostly fine. Maybe the middle stroke suddenly looks a little thick compared to these, which just is a factor of, let me show this. This is an interesting thing with italics as well. If you continually slant an upright rectangle, it does keep the same exact area of or volume of space. So say if we only typed a bunch of H's, technically this will use the same amount of ink or light up the same amount of pixels as it does if it's totally unslanted. So for that reason, like I sort of think that you don't need to do as much compensation as you might think if you're making an italic and want to keep the same color of text overall. Let's take this back to our normal italic angle. Getting a Christmas spirit here. Yeah, you can see that like this doesn't look like an italicized circle as a good geometric italic O should. But what is an italic circle? Well, the best answer I can kind of find after like looking pretty deeply at some great geometric fonts and also doing some experiments is instead of simply skewing the letter, what you want to do is partly skew it and partly rotate it. So for instance, if we just rotate it, oops, that is not the right way. If we just rotate it, that actually looks better than before, but it looks kind of rotated and almost like rotated too far. So suddenly it really reveals how kind of rectangular the actual shape of this O is. So here it looks like a circle optically, but once we rotate it, it really reveals that the shoulders are a little bit squared to give the optical appearance of a circle. So basically what this is all leading me to saying is the thing I found is that to make italics, you generally want to partly skew, partly rotate, and then go fix things so they look right. So it's kind of a long process, a lot more than you might expect. What I kind of take as a starting point is that I'll skew it by half. So, you know, I just like use Alfred app to calculate that. So 5.655. And I usually use the value 6.6. And so if I skew this by that and rotate it by that, I got to make sure it's negative, so it rotates that way like math. This is actually starting to look, to my eyes, a lot better. Like it's still keeping some geometry. and still keeping some italic nature. And yet it's kind of still not quite looking right. So my last things that I like to do are kind of make sure that the thickest parts kind of are aligned, and just for rendering purposes, it's important to kind of put the extrema back in at the top and bottom. It's actually, you could do extrema on the sides or you could leave them slanted. Both are useful in different contexts. I'll probably talk more around that soon. But yeah, basically what I do is like, and this is where actually the fact that it has an italic angle that's on a grid comes in handy, because I can say, move this point 10 down, holding shift and then pressing down, and then put it 2 in. So I can kind of like count and get it to be moving exactly with the italic angle. And already you can kind of see this is looking better, just with that fairly simple change. And then if I also, add extreme points here, I can maybe, like, I tend to like to bring this point out just a little bit so that the sort of, there's still sort of an upright structure of the kind of top and bottom of the font. And that kind of, for me, looks pretty much, especially if we look at just this part, looks pretty much like how I want it to. Font editors are cool because you can like delete a point like this that isn't extreme, and it tries to kind of keep the overall curvature. And actually, this is the main reason that I like to use glyphs for kind of the bulk drawing correction moments of making an italic rather than RoboFont. Just basically for the simple reason that glyphs is better at keeping that curve once you've deleted a point. So let me show you what I mean. And I'm not super protective of this script. I forget if I've already put it on GitHub Gists, but I'll probably do that and put a link in the video description in case you want to check it out, maybe try it out. It's not doing anything super special. It just tries to avoid, say, double transforming things that are composed from components, which is liable to happen if you just try to transform a whole font. By the way, I'm going to go over to Git, and you can see some of these changes that I made. The great part of a UFO font format is that every glyph is its own file. So if you're using Git, and especially with UI like VS Code, or there's a lot of ways to use Git, you can go and see that all these points are changed, but I don't want those changed. So I'm going to kind of discard the changes, and I don't have to do them. And then this has a very tiny change. My linting told me it should have 2 spaces there. So I'll just kind of leave that for later. Oh, and I turned off linting. Yeah, I'm going to turn that back on. Okay, so sure, I'll just linting. All right. That way I have a clean slate for changes I'm about to make. So, that whole scripting process, getting back to what I was saying before, I explained the fixes that go into an italic. That's why I have this faux italics folder versus this italic folder. So the faux italics are basically sources that have only been prepped in a very basic way, where a script has only skewed things that are all straight lines, but half skewed and half rotated things that are involving curves. And that way they are pretty close to what I want them to be. And actually I see in this particular script, I'm rotating a little more than I'm skewing. So that might be like 2/3 rotation, 1/3 skew. And I found that it's different for different styles. So for instance, I believe in my Lang family. For the italic here, I mean, it's very different italic than the Roman, so that was part of it, but I think it was more of a half and half kind of thing there. Yeah, honestly, I don't entirely remember at this point. But the point is, experimenting with those two factors is kind of something that's important in my experience. And this isn't something I invented, by the way. Lots of type designers take this approach to like partly rotating and partly skewing. And I'm just kind of telling you that this is a process that I also find useful. You could, of course, skew everything, and then you would simply have a little bit more redrawing to do. So as one example, also, actually, let me, this will be kind of a good look at it. Let me open these both with Font Goggles, which is an awesome little tool for previewing fonts. That's an interesting error that I should fix. That's cool. Font Goggles is an excellent tool for, wow, these lines are so distracting. Oh well, I'll be quick. It's an excellent tool for previewing font files of many types. So you can throw in TTFs, OTFs, UFOs, etc. And it shows like variable fonts really nicely and stuff. Awesome app to just look at what's in a font. Here you're seeing the difference between a faux italic that I've prepped and an italic that I've gone and actually fixed. So like, cool. Can I turn off the... That's probably a sensible decision, but unfortunate that I can't turn off these like stripy warning lines. Yeah. I don't think this is a word, but it's a good example of another thing I fixed in here, obviously. But yeah, basically these O's have been fixed to look a little more italic rather than just rotated. And then, for instance, the R's had to be fixed a little more. So I could kind of keep the curvature mostly that I liked over here, but then obviously fix the other side of it. So it's not just like straight up rotated. And that is what I've just started to do in the italic hairline display source. And I haven't yet moved the display bold and display ultra into the italic folder because I basically haven't fixed those at all. And yeah. So let's, by default, UFO is open in RoboFont. But as I said, I actually really love doing some of this bulk work. Oh, I had already opened it up. Some of this bulk work in Glyphs, mostly because it's very excellent at adding extreme points and then deleting the ones you don't want. So one thing I better check is what strategy I've used so far for... Okay, I'm gonna not change those. What strategy have I used so far for the side extrema? All right, so here I was finding, I think, that I could get the smoothest, most like natural italic look if I had vertical extrema. Some of the time, vertical extrema just aren't feasible or sensible in an italic. For instance, in the letter N, if you were trying to add vertical extrema, you would have a point here and a point here, at which time this would be a very short segment, and especially this would be a very short segment, and suddenly it would have a high likelihood of being bumpy, and then where still this would be completely incompatible with the upright, which wouldn't need that. And so, for instance, if you wanted to make a slant axis in a variable font, or even just like make interpolated or extrapolated, which is like interpolation, but it goes further along the curve. Versions of this N, you couldn't do that. So, yeah, I just wanted to check that in other families, I just leave the sides as slanted points. I've heard that the advantage to leaving them slanted is that it can actually be easier in like a width axis font with round characters, but I haven't personally experimented with that, but it makes sense. There may be a marginal rendering benefit to having vertical extrema on the sides, but mostly those matter at top and bottom, as far as I've heard and know about hinting and stuff. So let's copy this just so we have a reference point, put it in the background, and the hairline is very unforgiving for changes. You can see that even here it's like way too thin, and here it's a little too thick. You might have to view this YouTube video at a high resolution to really see some of these things. So if I delete a point here, it kept that curve pretty well intact, which is always, like, I'm very impressed at how well that works in glyphs. In RoboFont, you saw a moment ago, the curve can get kind of messed up. There are a lot of things I love about RoboFont, by the way. It's just that both of these apps have things they're good at and things that they're not as good at. So if you have the luxury of using them both, I think it's kind of a fun thing. If you were trying to decide to get just one as like a hobby, my recommendation would mostly be glyphs, unless you were particularly interested in learning about coding for fonts and using Git, in which case RoboFont can have an edge. It's a whole thing. I don't know. I like them both. All right. I think I probably say that in like every video. And yeah, at this point, I just start fixing. And usually I like to make videos after I've figured something out, and I can just kind of go and say what I'm doing. That feels better kind of than figuring it out live. But sometimes I feel like, you know, a lot of what type design is figuring things out live. So maybe it's interesting to make a video where I am figuring things out live. You can see how sort of difficult this style is to draw, because like every point movement you make is pretty apparent in the thickness and contrast of the stroke. By the way, that is because this font happens to have a units per M grid of 2048, which means that basically from here, the ascender to the descender, it's divided into 2048 little grid points. And so that gives you a bit higher resolution than a typical font, which typically is 1000. And then within that, these strokes are all about 2 units wide or thick, which is very thin. Usually hairlines are maybe like 12 to 20 units of 1000, which would be like 40 units here. So to compare, we could move a stroke out to there. Yeah, so that's a more typical weight for the thinnest part of a font. And yet I had seen people drawing thinnest possible hairline fonts and bragging about it, and I don't know that I probably wouldn't. I don't think I will necessarily ever make a font that is this thin again. unless it's commissioned or something. It is a cool exercise just to like understand how Bezier's work at this level. And my main thing is that I was seeing people talk about how they'd made the thinnest fonts or whatever. But I've never really seen them being sold. And I think that's because people give up before making them a really like a publicly available reality, because they do kind of come with so many challenges, just technical challenges of like building the font and advertising the font. Like it is kind of a little hard to tell people that there's a style of this type family that is like not really recommendable to use. Like that's a weird message to tell people. Like this family is perfect, except there's a foot gun in there or whatever. I don't know if that's an okay term to use, but like, you know, there's a way that you might mess yourself up or make a mistake as a user. Most people like to avoid having such caveats, which is sensible. But I feel like there's value to having weird fonts. And maybe there's value to having weird styles within a font. I don't know. I probably wouldn't recommend it for most people simply because it takes more time, a lot more time, to make such a thing. Yeah. Anyway, like partly this correction process is about doing the correction to a few key glyphs, like, you know, N, O, and now I've just kind of started into G, which isn't necessarily the one you would want to start with. But it's just kind of like a process of understanding what you have to do. And then once you get into the flow of it, you can kind of repeat that. The hard part about this hairline is that it's less forgiving. So whereas like the bold, you can kind of like have a bit of wiggle room. Here, I don't have much wiggle room. Then again, like part of making a font is about accepting where something looks good and where much more effort won't necessarily make it much better. I don't know. So it's about finding that point of like, I suppose you would say, diminishing returns. I don't, obviously, you know, I don't think it's reached that point yet because, you know, things still look like they are not finished. But yeah, essentially, like once you've fixed enough in one of these fonts, you start to like see the moves you've got to make. And then you can kind of slightly turn off your brain a little and just kind of go for it, which is a pretty nice place to be when you're working on a font some of the time. The other thing I like a lot in fonts is when I have to really think through tricky things and just kind of keep thinking. It's like, I guess why I'm drawn to making fonts that are a little bit complicated or complex at least. And I like code, and I specifically, at one point when I was just getting started, I would like have a TV show going in the background. It's possible somebody is doing that with this very YouTube video right now. They might be drawing a font and listening to me ramble in the background. I don't know. I'd be flattered if that's the case. Hi, leave a comment. I used to watch like Netflix shows and things, and I, you know people who still do that, and they're very productive and great type designers. So it's not necessarily something to avoid. But I found with me, I'm happier and if I can like focus on what I'm doing, and I never want to like spend time going down a path that is ill-advised, but I don't realize it because I'm not thinking as I'm working, which I think is very possible kind of to fall into that trap, especially if you're like being entertained by something in the background, like TV or whatever. I think it'd be entirely possible to kind of start doing a design thing that isn't necessarily what you want to do, and then maybe it's wasted time or something. Here for the E, and in fact, maybe by narrating my process, I'm running that risk anyway. Probably. So that's a good reason why, for instance, I wouldn't do a full-on narration of an entire type family, just because I think there's so many points at which it's very vital to sit and think about what you're actually doing. So I'm just kind of winging this a little bit. I basically want the bar to be, obviously horizontal and in the middle. I pasted this in the background, so I have a rough guide of where I want things to be as far as the outside curve. I'm going to hold Control Option as I drag, so like it kind of scales points as I drag. I don't know if I've talked about this before, but basically like if you just move points, it changes the curve completely very quickly. But if you do the scaling edit, it's better at keeping the overall type of curve, or like disrupting it less, and it allows you to have to change less. It's a really helpful drawing strategy for drawing type or lettering. Okay. And yeah, I still do have to fix it a little bit, so I'll probably like kind of experiment here. An interesting thing with drawing a hairline is that a lot of the time it's almost like drawing a single Bezier curve and trying to make that smooth. Like so much of the time I just put handles these like off curve points really close to one another and almost move them together as if they were one off curve point. That doesn't work 100%, but it's a close shortcut. It almost works. It gets you pretty close, at least, to what you want. And then once you get to this far, like you'll notice that it's thicker up here and then thins out. So at that point, you have to adjust these just slightly. Oops. By, only a couple of points or something. Yeah, and that's where this hairline becomes a little bit challenging. Something I usually do is try to have a smaller version of what I'm working on below, so I can really see what I'm doing. Yeah. And I think I was alluding to this earlier, but I'll fix some key glyphs and then I'll go back and like maybe, I'll just go through, let's see, like the Latin category and the basic. And for instance, I would just pull these up and then just go in a line, boom, 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 fixing them all, listening to music or maybe a podcast once I really figure out what my strategy is. And then it's just kind of a long process of fixing all of the other glyphs and doing it for the other sources and cleaning up the parts where that maybe approach doesn't work as well as I'd want it to. It's a surprisingly involved effort, which is why it's taken some time to add italics to name sans. But I'm very kind of like hell-bent on finishing this family within 2022. It's been quite a long time coming. So I'm like pretty enthusiastic to spend my spare time, and even some of my work time as much as I can to make this thing complete. And I really love the design of this family. Like, I still am pretty stoked on where it is and, what people have done with it and what I still think people can do with it. So I guess wish me luck. And I hope that I can show off the result of this italic push pretty soon. And have like my first complete retail family. I'm pretty dedicated for this one to be the first complete retail family for AeroType. I've completed other families, but like as open source projects or like custom projects for specific clients, much smaller, more focused things some of the time. This will be a big thing for me to finish and put out into the world. So hopefully I will post more about it. Hopefully this was an insightful kind of thing for you to see where I'm at and what my process is for fixing letters up like this. If you're working on an italic, best of luck to you. It's almost like learning to draw type again for the first time, getting comfortable with this process. It's pretty painful at first. Like, things just don't look right for a while. But once you know a few things, like, it can be better. It's going to be a definite push to make this display side of the name sans family italic, because the whole point and goal of this family is to make it as perfect as possible, kind of like as natural as possible. That's just like something that italics can be slightly at odds with. Like, wow, God, look at the fussiness of that one point. If I move it around, I may have to detach this counter kind of at that point to avoid that ridiculous sensitive curve. And for reasons like that, I'm mostly thinking I won't. I'm not 100% dedicated to this yet, but I don't think I'll have an interpolatable italic axis in name sans. Actually, one more thing I'll say here is I've made this slant and italic variable axis test for browsers. And I did a version of this a couple of years ago, and then just this week went and updated it to make it more legible and readable, and just to see, like, has the scene of this changed at all? And to explain it real quickly, this is just kind of like a bonus part of the video, I guess. The CSS spec says how browsers should treat various ways to make a font italic in various italic focused axes in variable fonts. So there's like a slant axis, which has a specified number of degrees for rotation, and then an italic axis, which is just 0 to 1, Roman to italic. And in CSS or HTML, there's various ways to apply italic styles. So the CSS level 4 spec for typography says what these things should do, but the results in actual browsers are very inconsistent. So Safari, as we're seeing here, anytime you see pink, it's failing a test. And then these two are sort of ambiguous what should happen. So I don't know if it's failing or not exactly. But yeah, pretty bad. Chrome has gotten slightly worse than it was 2 years ago. Firefox is the only one that's pretty darn good. But even it fails one of these tests and has an iffy result for a couple of them. So yeah, if you want to see this, aerotype.github.io/vf-slnt-test. And I'll link that in the description as well. But yeah, pretty dismal look for fonts that are variable that include a slant or italic axis. And that's part of the other reason why I'm not going to stress too much on giving name sans a continuous italic variable axis. It's already just such a lift to make a really wide weight axis and optical size axis and make it really high quality. So yeah, one way that I'm going to make this just ever so slightly easier on myself is to have these be separate upright versus italic families. Yeah, which is already like kind of what's happening here. Like this italic font is a variable font with a weight axis. This upright font is a separate variable font with a weight and optical size axis. And they work pretty nicely together. This solution works a lot better in browsers and CSS and things. So this part of the reason, you know, if I were making a continuous italic axis, I would break them up as separate fonts anyway until browsers got their act together, which who knows how long that'll take. And that's what I would advise users to use, kind of the split upright versus italic font, even in the case that a font does have a continuous axis. Yeah, so anyway, that's my little rant or complaint about italic variable axes right now. Yeah, again, good luck to you if you're drawing fonts yourself. If not, I don't know how you made it through this video, but thanks for sticking around. Hope you have a great weekend or week, whatever the case may be. Thanks.